Thanks for coming, everybody. My name is David Sandalo. I'm the inaugural fellow here at Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy. So the period from May 1st to September 30th of this year was the warmest 6-month period that was ever recorded on planet Earth. NASA's been keeping temperature records back to 1880s, and the period from May 1 to September 30, 2014 was the warmest that was ever recorded. And worldwide, the period from 2001 to 2010 was the warmest decade. And global emission trends are not encouraging. Concentrations of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere are highest that they've ever been in human history. They show no signs of abating. And last year, concentrations rose at the highest pace in many, many years. So I just thought I'd start you out with some gloom and doom on this topic. And there's a lot of that. And I find as I talk about this topic, which I do a lot, that there's a lot of people that are ready to resign themselves to whatever consequences may come. And so 6 months ago, when I was talking to Roger Sant, and he showed me part of a speech he was giving, I thought it would be particularly exciting to have him come talk. Because as you'll see, Roger draws on his experience and offers both some historical perspectives, but also some optimism about the future and what we can do. Our event tonight is part of a continuing series that we're holding here on energy and climate change. Under the leadership of our director, Jason Bordoff, who tonight he's in London as part of a multi-city European tour. But I especially want to highlight that on November 7th, we are hosting an event on the Energy and Climate Nexus, which features Nobuo Tanaka, the former executive director of the IEA, and Dr. Klaus Lochner, professor of geophysics here. And that's November 7th on the Energy and Climate Nexus. So Roger Sant is the co-founder and chairman emeritus of the AES Corporation, which is a Fortune 200 company that generates and distributes electric power operating in over 20 countries, and it's widely recognized for its sustainability focus. Roger's career has really been remarkable. His business career was amazing, but he is far more than one of the most successful businessmen of his generation. His civic and philanthropic activities have already had a dramatic impact, from the Amazon to the Anacostia. He served on the board as chairman of the board of the World Wildlife Fund US, chairman of the board of regents of the Smithsonian, and with his wonderful wife Vicki, he runs the Summit Foundation. Early in his career, he served as the assistant administrator for energy conservation and the environment at the Federal Energy Administration, which is a precursor to the US Department of Energy. And I particularly want to highlight that Roger's generosity extends actually way beyond his philanthropic giving. Roger's hugely generous with his time. And he's provided really crucial insights and guidance to me and to many colleagues in my generation in the energy and environment field. So I am hugely honored to welcome Roger Sant to Columbia.
Okay. Yeah, that's so there are three things I'd like to focus on tonight. First, the immensely successful effort we've made in the last 40 years to clean up our air and to solve the energy crisis. And I want to use that experience to sort of build on what does that inform us as to how to tackle carbon pollution. Because if we can learn something from those 40 years that will affect us now, it might help us move forward. And finally, to just give my own observations of how we solve big problems together. Because I'm World Wildlife Fund, I've got to start someplace else, so a little closer to the ground. This obviously is a rhino, second largest land mammal on the planet, next to the elephant. This is in particular a white rhino from Africa. And the problem with rhinos is they got a gold bullion on their head. This horn is worth more than its weight in gold, and maybe 2x. So it is literally like an animal running around the plains of Africa with a gold bullion. It's a pretty tempting target for poachers. And so we've had a huge struggle. As much as 50 years ago, we thought rhinos were extinct. They kind of came back. And so I want to talk a little bit about what we've learned from that. This is the northern white rhino. It's up in Kenya and above Botswana. And there, to fight the poachers, we went about it in sort of a regulatory approach. We said, let's ban poaching, let's ban hunting, put some boots on the ground, and we'll stop it. We called it the ban and enforcement approach. And the sad thing is, maybe because of governments, maybe because of wars, we're now down to 6 animals left on the planet. 3 of which, actually last week it was 7. So there are 3 of them in captivity in Kenya that have guards, as you see there. The other 3 are in zoos. All are too old to reproduce, and so we effectively are looking at extinction. Now, not a great way to start this talk, so I'm going to move to something a little more positive, and this is the southern white rhino, which is really in all of South Africa and Namibia. They did the same thing. They did ban enforcement, but they decided they had to try to do something to make a live animal worth more than a dead one. So they introduced some market incentives, and they did a very controversial thing to start with. Trophy hunts, regulated trophy hunts, brought in huge amounts of money, which they could use for making the animal really valuable as a trophy. Secondly, they changed the ownership laws so private ranchers, private citizens could own rhinos, and it gave them some incentive to create more. And then they actually went through some sale and auction process, so it essentially gave competition to the black market. So you had market incentives out there, and the happy news, 20,000 of them. A pod of animals that you thought was extinct 50 years ago is now at a sustainable population and growing. Not all green, because there's still some poaching going on, but the whole idea of market incentives tells you that's the only difference between the two. And we ought to take note of that. We ought to learn something from that, because as you look at 20,000 and growing versus extinct, the only difference between the approach was some market incentives, and some fairly clever market incentives. So we'll come back to that. Another story, one that I lived through, was the '73 energy crisis. And looking around the room, not very many of you experienced those gasoline lines, but maybe you did. I don't want to pick on you, but I did. Anyway, as you recall from your books, that OPEC, particularly the Arab nations of OPEC, cut off our oil at that point, and we were scared. It was kind of the first time we didn't have ready access to energy, and the president at that time was Richard Nixon, a Republican, a person who had been fairly friendly to some environmental legislation, but when he was hit with this, it was kind of a crisis for him as well as for the country. And the first thing he did was to create something called the Federal Energy Administration. It was just a way of creating a bureaucracy to try to deal with the issues that people saw around the issue, and they created a department that was responsible for conserving energy for the first time. And they appointed a little-known Stanford professor who knew absolutely nothing about energy to head up that department, and that would be me. And I remember at the time thinking, geez, I don't know the difference between a BTU and a kilowatt hour. You know, how am I going to get through Senate confirmation? Little comfort to the fact that if you knew anything, you were considered to have a conflict of interest and wouldn't get confirmed anyway. But anyway, there I was. And I remember cramming just enough to get through Senate confirmation, but after that, sitting at my desk thinking, what on earth am I going to do? How do we conserve energy? And nobody else knew either, so we decided, well, we got to just try some stuff. So we did some kind of goofy things like speed limit. For those of you who were around at that time, you can thank me later, but we decided that if we could cut the speed limit from 70 to 55, the numbers told us we'd save 28% of our gasoline. So we did it. 55 it was. You can imagine it didn't succeed. people, one, didn't drive slower, and the ones who did were pretty angry about it. And we learned something from that that hopefully informed us. Something that worked a little better as we looked at the car fleet at that time, and we were averaging about 13.5 miles a gallon. And that was pretty lousy compared to the European cars, the Japanese cars. And so we brought the auto companies in and said, come on, guys, we can do better than that. And they said, no. We are selling the Americans just what they want to buy, and we're not going to change. And so we went up in a hill, and happily we had a pretty friendly bipartisan support for this, and they changed. They said the law is now 27.5 miles per gallon in 5 years from now, and you can see what happened. Immediately that started to put a damper on oil consumption. It started to make people think we could do better, and it created a kind of optimism, and you can look at prices at that time, and they started to stabilize. But then we lost our nerve, and for the next 30 years, we did nothing. We just sort of said, well, that's enough. When obviously the technology was sort of driving us in a different direction, but we said that's enough. And none of us could ever figure out why that was the case, but I guess we just literally lost our nerve. The good news is that we're back on track again, and the EPA, using the Supreme Court's ruling that carbon dioxide as a pollutant, said we're going to double again. So by 2025, the new car fleet will be 55 miles per gallon. Now, maybe there will be some slips along the way, but that's the goal, and we finally have a goal, and you can see that that's going to make a huge difference in carbon emissions. So that was a little better success. And then we did something on the voluntary side. We said, well, people would like to do the right thing. Let's just give them some information. So we created an energy labeling guide. It essentially said all of the appliances that you buy will have a label on them showing how efficient they are. And it was remarkable. Not only did people start buying more efficient appliances, the manufacturers started building more efficient appliances. And that program is still in effect. If you go to a store today, you see a label that looks just like that. So 40 years later, we're still giving people information, and you can kind of track the efficiency of appliances, and it was a major success. Well, those are just three of the many, many things that we tried, but it sort of informs us as we begin to look at carbon. And carbon has flared up in recent years because we now understand carbon pollutes. And we're trying to look at all the effects of that, and clearly, as you hear around the country, not everyone agrees that it does as much damage as I think it does, but there's not very many people who think that more carbon in the air is good. At least we have some agreement that more carbon in the air is probably not a good thing. So we've begun to look at what to do about it, but just a little more background, and you all are probably more familiar with this than anyone, but just look at the 400,000 years of CO2 concentrations, kind of going between a band of 200 parts per million and 300 parts per million. Pretty stable through that whole period. And where do you think humans showed up on that scale? About halfway. I mean, Homo sapiens come on the planet around 200,000 years ago. We have data from the 4 billion years before that, and it shows probably wider fluctuations, and the planet survived. But this chart is interesting because it tells you sort of this is the scale of human occupation of the planet, the last 200,000 years, and then we see what happened because of the Industrial Revolution, that it was going along at sort of the top of that band for the last 1,000 years until we got into industrialization, and now it's just passed through 400. And everyone out there, all of the scientific community is saying if we don't level off at 450, we're probably not going to be able to hold the temperature increase to 2 degrees or less, 2 degrees Celsius or less. So we're looking at a slope there that's going straight up. And the task ahead of us is to not only stop it, but to turn it completely over and straighten it out at 450. So that gives you some sense of the issue, the problem that we're dealing with, and why we think there's some urgency. There's a lot of things we don't know. You know, I'll concede we don't know, just like back in the energy crisis, there are a lot of things we didn't know. I mean, we don't know for sure what solutions would be best. We don't know for sure what investments will probably give us the best return, or how long they'll take, or how much they'll cost. But we know one thing probably for sure is doing something now is going to be a heck of a lot cheaper than doing something later. That's probably one thing we could agree on. And so we're at a stage where those doubts and fears and skepticism are probably driving us way more than they should. So those doubts and fears are probably what stops us. I think we can go back to the energy crisis and draw on that for a moment and say in the 70s we had some similar kinds of beliefs. We first thought that energy was scarce. Probably the biggest thing that was talked about during the energy crisis in the 70s was we're running out of this stuff, and it's only a matter of time until it's completely gone. And because of that, prices are just going to keep going up, and costs are only going to get worse, and we're going to have a real budgetary problem on our hands. And pertinent to what I was trying to do is there was a lot of people who felt that if you conserved energy, it was sort of anti-American. You know, you can't grow the economy and conserve energy because those two things oppose each other. So there's a lot of concern that we couldn't do that. Truth is, all three of those things were so wrong. So wrong. And let me show you the data. Oil reserves, which we thought were 30 years at the then rate of consumption, are now 50. Wow, somebody's done something. Instead of that line going down, it just kept going up. And as you'll see in a moment, it's not so much that prices were doing something. Sure, they went up right after the embargo in the mid-70s, but then they stabilized. And you can see that price increases in real terms, taking inflation out of it, really tell us that we haven't had the kind of price increases that anybody expected. In fact, when you look at that kind of mauve line, is that mauve or is that, I don't know, green or, it shows you that electricity has actually declined in real terms. So the price of electricity today is slightly lower than it was in 1973. That's remarkable. And it's something that sort of shows you all of those fears that we had were probably unfounded, but the other way of looking at it is maybe the doubts and fears drove us into doing some things that were pretty remarkable. Finally, conservation, a great story. We're using about half the energy per constant dollar of GDP as we were using in '74. And as you can see on the right side, economic growth has continued on a per capita basis and, of course, on an absolute basis. So it was probably one of the best investments we could make in that whole array of opportunities that we had, was to invest in efficiency. So the things that we thought in '73 were so wrong probably led us to do some things, a whole array of things, that turned out to make all of those fears completely false. And I just sort of wonder if those same fears that we have today, as we look at the data, are not driving us and aren't just as false as they were in the '70s. I use an ice core here because that's how we have the data about concentrations. And it's just a good symbol of the problem. The things I hear, you probably can add to this list. A lot of people say, well, you know, even if it is a problem, we can't afford to fix it. It's just too expensive to take carbon out of the system. A lot of people feel we don't even have the technology to do it. They don't buy into the fact that renewables are really a pretty competitive option. And of course, the biggest is that it's not our fault. Either it's India and China's fault, or it can't be mankind. This is just a natural variation. So that's kind of what we're dealing with, and there's not exactly the same as we were facing in the 70s, but it's not too far off. And it sort of feels like this time, though, it's sticking us a little longer than it would. You've all seen the things that we're now starting to experience. We see almost weekly reports of glaciers and ice sheets melting. This is a little island out in the Pacific called Kiribati. The B-A-T-A is pronounced by the islanders Ba. And 100,000 people live on this island. Well, the highest elevation on the island is 20 feet. So with expansion, with ocean, temperatures rising, water expands. And so everybody knows that we're going to get sea level rise. Well, the people on that island all live at a level where they're going to be flooded out. And so the president of Kiribati said, we may already be at the point where we have to plan for not having a home. I mean, losing an island, the biodiversity of that island is crucial. That's important to us. But what about the people? The people, where do they go? And it's not as though this is an isolated instance. There's probably 10,000 islands like this, and that's not counting the Bangladesh lowlands and the Florida lowlands, and that's just one aspect of what we're now experiencing. Record heat is probably, David mentioned it at the beginning, this is the warmest 6 months we've ever recorded. But what's interesting about this is in the United States that record highs have been increasing for 50 years. So record highs, which used to be about half of the record lows, is now twice as much as the record lows. So we're now experiencing twice as many record highs. And that isn't just leading us to maybe be a little less comfortable. It's leading to deaths. The deaths now from heat exposure are higher than any other form coming weather-related deaths. So it's a human problem. Why do I feel optimistic then? So why am I thinking it's in us to be able to do this? Because I guess I'm probably the oldest one in the room. I grew up in a depression. And I saw how we got through that. And then I saw how we dealt with World War II and saw how we got through that. And then I had the energy crisis and was more intimately involved in that. And it just seems to me like my experience tells me problem solving is in our DNA. It's what gives us fun. I mean, I can tell you that my definition of fun is having a really big problem and finding a way through it. It's probably as much fun as, we used to say fun was one of our values at our company, and people thought that meant we partied a lot. The fact was that we just loved getting in a room and taking a big, hairy problem and trying to figure it out. And that's probably my most favorite definition of fun. Well, anyway, I think it's in our nature to do this. So here's a couple of examples. We had a power plant in Thames, Connecticut on the Thames River. And at the time, we were trying to prove that you could make electricity that cheaper than the utilities were making. That was sort of the nature of our business. So we had this coal plant in Connecticut long before we knew that there was a carbon problem. We didn't know about carbon dioxide, so we were very proud of the way we'd cleaned up sulfur dioxide and NOx and all of those things. But I was on the board of the World Resources Institute at that time, and I was starting to get data. And it was scary, you know, and so I came back, and this is like 1987, 88, and I went to our people, and I said, geez, you know, we're building a coal plant. It's just contributing to this problem, and it's only going to get worse. And what do you think we ought to do about it? Should we get out of the business, or should we do something else? Well, one really thoughtful woman said, well, let's plant trees. Sounds like a good idea. She said, yeah, trees sequester carbon. If we could plant trees enough to offset our emissions, we could have a carbon neutral plant. I said, geez, that's kind of an interesting idea. How many trees, Cheryl? 52 million. Yikes. I said, how on earth do we plant 52 million trees? Well, she said, I can tell you how. We've got this project with CARE down in Guatemala, and they're planting trees because they need it, and we can piggyback on that. And I said, okay, how much is it going to cost us? And she said, $2 million. I said, geez, we're a little company. We only made $2 million this year. She said, well, you want to be carbon neutral, that's what it's going to take. And so we did it. Well, how did it turn out? Well, those are the trees, a few of them. The plant has been shut down because it ran through its 25 years of useful life, so there's no more coal plant, but the trees are still there. So we're maybe a little net plus at this point, but we got a little publicity, some of it good, some of it was lampooning. You can see that the New Yorker thought it was kind of silly, but at least we were in the New Yorker. Hey, you know, that's a... I think, when I look back on it though, I think our Thames plant was the first carbon neutral coal plant in the world. And I think it tells you that there are probably some solutions like that people, when they're really put to a creativity test, do it. Here's a bigger example of problem solving. Remember in 1970, that was Earth Day. Earth Day 1970 was kind of a big day for environmentalists. It was when we sort of made our voice more known than it was before. And somehow President Nixon and all of Congress took that message and said, this dirty air is really not something we can be proud of. And so they passed something called the Clean Air Act. And it regulated 4 pollutants on the left there: particulates, sulfur dioxide, which is just acid rain, carbon monoxide, and volatile organic compounds. Took those 4, the other 2, nitrous oxides and smaller particulates, were added later. But we created the Clean Air Act just to regulate those pollutants. Again, it was not just for improving our scenery, it was because people were dying prematurely of asthma and other pollution-related deaths. Well, look what happened. In 1990, we had another president, but by then, we'd already started well down our road, and sulfur dioxide was about 30% lower, even though the economy is growing. And another Republican president came along and said, we can do better. So we added NOx and smaller particulates to the list and said, let's make those 6 priority pollutants, and let's put a price on 1 or 2 of those. And so they tried playing with marketable allowances of SO2. You could say, instead of putting on a scrubber, you might buy an allowance from somebody who had one available. And that trading was what led to what we call cap and trade. It was the first time we'd ever tried that. Well, it was so immensely successful that it just drove sulfur dioxide down to levels today that are more than 82% lower than they were in 1970. And all of the other pollutants are in a scale about like that. That's American triumph. I mean, how could we not look at that and say, my gosh, we did something that people thought was near impossible, and we did it without increasing energy prices, as I've shown previously. Well, last year, actually the last 3 years, the Supreme Court has been saying, should we consider the 7th pollutant? What would that be? Carbon dioxide. in Massachusetts versus EPA, the Supreme Court was faced with the idea that should CO2 be a regulated pollutant just like the other 6? And they said, you certainly have the right to do it. You need to get a finding, but you can do it. I put it on the list because in 2013 it really became clear that it wasn't just for motor vehicles, it was across the board. And it's at 120 because it was 20% higher in 2013 than it was in 1970. But it's now a regulated pollutant, and thanks to the Supreme Court, stuff is starting to happen. The Environmental Protection Agency, of course, put out their power plant reduction plan, which was just introduced a few months ago. You might say, well, you're a power plant operator. Why would you ever think that's a good idea? Well, I think it's the best idea I've ever seen. It's not only did it need to be done, but it's being done in the most thoughtful, creative way I can imagine. It really gave baselines different for some states because of their mix of electric generation. It gave all sorts of opportunities for people to collaborate and find solutions. It even gave states the chance to pass a carbon tax if they wanted to, instead of having a regulatory approach. But the most important thing, and I think it's, as you all think about Paris in December of next year, it gave us the ability to exert U.S. leadership for maybe the first time in a good long time. And for me, that probably is the most important. But as I've looked into that, I really do believe that after hearing the comments around the country, this is going to be a pretty important part of our tool. The interesting thing is, besides that, a whole bunch of other things are happening. I'm probably most impressed with this group of mayors called the C40, which is led by Bloomberg, which clearly had a goal to reduce carbon by 80% in 2050, the 80-50 rule, and the baseline was 1990. This is remarkable, and the mayors are really doing the things that they should do to get there. The California Cap and Trade program, which California just said, well, if the feds aren't going to do it, we're going to do it. And the RGGI over on the left is the Northeastern response to do something similar. And you're all aware of energy tax credits and renewable portfolio standards. And I just mentioned the fuel economy standards. And there's a whole bunch of other things that I could mention. Individual actions, corporate CEOs taking. So I'm pretty excited about what this has unleashed. And as we look to our past, what stops us seems to be what saves us. What stops us seems to give us the incentive to figure out what to do about it. I love this picture. Some of you may remember the movie Apollo 13. This is the control room celebrating the recovery of that capsule. I mean, if you did see the movie, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And the kind of solutions and problem solving they did on that mission is probably as iconic as anything could be. But that's why I love the picture. But using that as sort of a symbol, what have we learned? What have we learned about solving big problems? Well, first of all, we have to stick together. You know, the Clean Air Act didn't get done because we had a faction here and a faction there. It was because that law was passed by 90% of Congress. And it really didn't matter what party you belonged to. Those were the good old days. That's when we stuck together, and look what happened. We really have something we should be so proud of that we ought to celebrate it every year. The second thing, and I think we see the illustrations of that in everything that we all do, is you try a lot of stuff. I tried to mention a few of the things we tried during the energy crisis that, you know, some worked and some didn't work, but we tried a lot of things. And we clearly weren't afraid to fail. In fact, we felt failure was a part of the learning process, and I don't know, we listened to a guy from Google last night who said their hit rate is like 0.7. And I really challenged that. I said, that seems way too high. Shouldn't it be more like 0.3 or 0.2? Why shouldn't we be taking more risk than getting a 0.7? I mean, baseball players, if they get 0.3, really are really pretty good. Anyway, be willing to fail often, and of course the most important part is never give up. This symbol of this Apollo 13 is probably the most tenacious group of never give up people that I've ever seen. Well, those four things seem to be the components of solving big problems together, and so here we sit with government regulation, which I've gone through. The EPA is doing some things both on CAFE standards and on power plants. And a lot of states are doing some things. And we have a lot of individual actions. I mentioned corporate CEOs. You all have probably changed out your light bulbs to be a more efficient bulb at least. And maybe you've got a Prius, or maybe you've done something. I mean, I'm kind of proud of my Tesla, so I won't, I'll take a little credit myself. So we have a bunch of individual actions. We have some government regulation. We don't have the thing that we needed for the rhino, is market incentives. Right now, we don't have any penalty for emitting carbon, nor do we have any reward for building something that doesn't emit carbon. We don't have any way of rewarding or penalizing those actions. And so we're kind of stuck with the two things on both ends, and it kind of leaves us short of what was really needed. It's back to the rhino case that I just mentioned. The only difference between a successful and growing population of southern white rhinos versus the northern white rhino that's extinct is market incentives. And I think if you just extrapolate that, you know what I'm talking about. Same thing on energy crisis. Thanks to OPEC, we had market incentives. They raised the price so quickly that all of us jumped to trying to respond to that market incentive. We didn't do anything with a tax, but we certainly got the market incentives we needed, and so we got the greater efficiency, we got the increased reserves, we got the cleaner air. With climate, we're still just kind of hampered because we only have regulation and voluntary action. And as a result, we have some problems with carbon that are really evident. So I come out that a price on carbon is essential. Maybe through the EPA regs we'll get a price on carbon in the states, but what would even be more valuable is a price on carbon in a federal sense. And that's a tall order, but we've just got to keep trumpeting that message. And for me, that's a carbon tax, just because I think you could make it revenue neutral if you wanted to. It doesn't have to be a way of collecting revenue. You could make it such that you're replacing a payroll tax, let's say, with a carbon tax, a consumption tax on a bad, replacing a tax on a good, like payroll. So where I come out, where I'd like to finish, is most of my experience, almost all of my experience, said people are really good. People that I've experienced working with all want to do the right thing, and when you give them the right incentives, you really get some amazing solutions. And so I think that's where we're at. We're just kind of missing all of the incentives we need to get the amazing solutions that we got out of clean air and out of the energy crisis. I finish with this picture of the capsule being recovered. One of the things you think about there is we didn't really want to recover that capsule. We wanted to recover the people in it. And to me, that's where we maybe missed it a little bit, is it's not the planet we're trying to save necessarily, although that's essential for our livelihood, it's the people. So if that's any indication, and I think it is, we need to focus on whether humans can survive this grand experiment that we're currently in. and we've got to do something about it. Again, I'll conclude by saying good people exist. We just need some incentives, and that'll lead to solutions. So thank you very much.
Roger, thank you. That was spectacular. Have a seat. Thank you again. So we're joined by two other remarkable people. Let me embarrass them by introducing them quickly and then have a conversation. On my far left is George Frampton, who is currently the principal of New Energy Advisors and co-founder of the Partnership for Responsible Growth. Roger's career includes service to the President of the nation as chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality. He was Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Fish and Wildlife, President of the Wilderness Society, and a very distinguished legal career as well. Partner at Boies Schiller, clerk to Justice Blackmun on the U.S. Supreme Court. Also joined by Mona Sutphin, who is currently partner at Macro Advisory Partners, and her distinguished career includes service as Deputy Chief of Staff to President Obama at the White House, with an office a few feet down the hall from the Oval Office.
But no window.
Mona has served as Managing Director at UBS and Stonebridge International. She served in the U.S. Foreign Service from 1991 to 2000, serving at the NSC, National Security Council, among other places. She's the co-author of The Next American Century, a member of the President's International Advisory Board, and I serve the most important for last, a member of the Advisory Board of Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy. And thank you for that, Mona. So Roger, thank you again. And now the good and inspiring ideas that you provided get to be tested, and in the cauldron of George and Mona. And after we talk for a while, then I want to ask any of you to come up and ask questions as well. So let me start with George, and just generally, George, as you listen to that, any ideas you want to pick out that you particularly agree with or disagree with?
David said he was going to ask me, is this achievable? I think it is. I think most climate advocates, experts, even most people in the business community would agree with Roger that the only really effective, long-term, certainly the least expensive way to deal with the climate crisis is ultimately to put a price on carbon, domestically and internationally. So how do we get there? In starting this organization with two friends, a former timber industry CEO and environmentalist who's also a former congressman and a former businessman and investor who's an Obama ambassador to Austria, we sort of started to ask ourselves, how do you achieve this? By embracing two propositions that you may or may not agree with. One is that only Congress, in the U.S., it has to start with the U.S., and in the U.S. only Congress can price carbon. So like it or not, no matter how dismaying you may find this, we have to come back to Congress at some point. And if you know you're going to do that, we have to start now. Because whether the window opens in 2017 or maybe even before, these kinds of initiatives can never be achieved unless you're prepared. You don't get active when the window opens. You build for years to be there so you can take advantage of the window when it opens. And the second proposition is you cannot build mainstream support for a major policy initiative like this around an idea, a concept. It's not going to help us to try to build mainstream support around the notion that you have to price carbon. You have to have something that's specific enough to go out and make an argument that appeals to people, that's economically sound, and has a chance of getting people from different interest groups to embrace it. You don't have to have a piece of legislation or a specific proposal, but you have to have something to put forward. And in our case, we've chosen to use as our sort of educational vehicle, both up on the Hill and with business executives, a revenue-neutral upstream carbon tax collected at the mine mouth and the refinery, all of the money going back through tax reductions to corporations and individuals. So there's no, it's revenue neutral, there's no additional government spending. 50% in our sort of trial balloon, 50% or more goes back through a reduction of the corporate tax rate, which at least ostensibly is favored by Republicans and Democrats, and the other 50% to individuals to compensate for increased energy costs. And a $20 or higher carbon tax would allow you to compensate at least 80%, maybe 85% of individuals for increased energy costs, according to the modeling that's been done in the last couple of years. The reason we've chosen this and think that, you know, there will come a time, at least in 2017 with a new president, when new presidents normally confront big issues, and tax reform and the budget and climate change will still be big issues in 2017. The reason we've chosen this as our educational vehicle is that it's probably the only pricing carbon mechanism or policy instrument that increases GDP, so it's pro-growth, it creates jobs, it makes U.S. companies more competitive in a global economy, it decreases both corporate and individual taxes, and it has a very long-run significant impact if the tax is high enough in driving down CO2 emissions. So that's an illustrative example in which you can say to people who are climate deniers, I think we're supposed to call them climate skeptics now, you don't believe in climate change, or you believe it's too difficult or too expensive, or it's too soon to confront this issue, but you should be for this carbon tax proposal because it stands on its own 4 legs, a table, or 2 legs, as a good economic fiscal proposal. And if you are wrong about climate change, and it doesn't involve any new government spending, if you are wrong about climate change, then 15 or 20 years from now, the costs are going to begin to be astronomical. And this is the cheapest insurance policy we can possibly buy against the possibility that you're wrong. So theoretically, this is a proposal that should be acceptable to Tea Party people, to libertarians, to Democrats, to Republicans, and to business. Whether it is or not, we hope to find out.
Great. So George, so you accept Roger's premise and point here that we do have a carbon tax, and you're out there working to try and figure out a way that it might work within the current political climate. Mona, do you want to comment either on any of Roger's other points or on this notion of carbon tax and how we might go about making it happen politically?
Sure. So one observation, which I think he's right about the need for this market incentive, but I'm working for Rahm Emanuel, I think it's been in a bunch of books that he said you need a crisis to motivate people to do things that they otherwise wouldn't think about doing. And obviously we had that crisis with the financial crisis. And the difference with what was going on in the 70s is that you had something that exacted pain on people at that moment that was measurable in their pocketbook for that 5 minutes, that was measurable in dollars and cents. And so the cost of energy efficiency made sense because you were already having to pay, right? And I think that's what's really hard about this issue is that, I mean, obviously you always have this problem of diffuse benefits and near-term costs, but this is like that on steroids, I think, in many respects. Because when people experience the effects of climate change, there's obviously a huge fight about, well, what is the source of this? There's a lot of confusion. It's easy for people to take that and spin it. And I think the most likely place where you're going to get to some of these market solutions is when, in fact, there's a different kind of crisis. Now, during the Obama administration, we put a cap-and-trade bill, piece of legislation out. Obviously, it didn't make it its way all the way through. But from a revenue perspective, it is good to have it be revenue neutral for certain political arguments. For others, if you're looking to deal with our fiscal issues, maybe it's better if it isn't revenue neutral, right, on the road. So what I concluded in just seeing all of this over the years, working on the politics of these things, if you want to do something big has to happen so that you can have a different conversation with the American people about what price they're willing to pay. But I completely agree. The other thing I learned from healthcare and Dodd-Frank and a whole bunch of other pieces of legislation we moved, was that the intellectual work of coming up with solutions so that the toolbox is filled with lots of tools, that you need all of that done. It all needs to be scored. It all needs to be debated in elite audiences. It all needs to be really, really well understood so that when the window opens, you can open up the toolbox and say, okay, you know what, now we're going to move with X, Y, and Z. So I think it's really essential. And I think just one little practical thing is, as long as it has the T word involved in it, tax, it's going to be hard, right? So people need to figure out a way to talk about it so that it doesn't. People say, well, how can I be paying less if it's a tax, right? So the simplicity of how you describe what what is in the toolbox is essential, because people, not members, you can convince people, members of Congress, you can convince elite audiences that this makes sense, but the 30-second soundbite version of this also has to make sense to people. And it can't be demagogued by others, because the second it can all get torn down in 5 seconds, as we've seen with lots of good policy that's ended up on the cutting room floor, unfortunately.
So Roger, Mona's making a powerful point here about the difference between the energy crisis and climate change, and there's a difference between Apollo 13 and climate change, too, right? Apollo 13 is visible, tangible. 3 people are going to die unless we solve this problem. Climate change is much more difficult to visualize.
No,
Any reaction from a political standpoint in that?
No, I'd have to concede. And the only trouble on the other side of that is every other pollutant that we've had, it has a residence time of a few years. This has a few 100,000 years. So you got the other side of that coin is if you decide to postpone your action, you're stuck. And I guess that's the same, why I'd agree with you, but it's why it compels us to even work harder.
No.
Because it's not as though we sort of have the luxury of waiting for the world to really give us a strong piece of evidence. We're getting some, fortunately, and that's causing something. But I agree with you. People were really scared in the energy crisis, and they were ready for us to give them some solutions. It's not as clear at this point.
Yeah, but sometimes though I notice that the crisis can be a different. We had a financial crisis, right, in 2008, and we decided to maybe try to move some other things that were not related to that crisis, right?
Yeah.
So the crisis moment doesn't necessarily always have to have a direct line, but you do have to have something that happens that says to people, we have to think about what's possible in a different way. And those moments don't actually, unfortunately, come all that often. But I do think there is a moment where all of a sudden people are willing to think about things in different ways.
Well, I think the other argument is certainly, and Bob Litterman is here, who makes it better than anybody I know, that we spend our lives pricing risk. Most of us have risk in our lives, and we either buy insurance or we buy commodities, and we put a risk premium on the things that we think are risky. And it does seem to me that just the evidence would say that rational people would want to be putting a risk premium at this point. Right. Even if we're not seeing all of the evidence now. And as Bob points out very well, risk premiums are different than insurance policies. But nonetheless, whatever context you want to think about it, that's certainly a time when I'll just come back on George. I have decided that this will not happen unless it's a Republican idea. I've decided that there is no Democrat out there who's ever going to push through a tax on carbon. And so I'm trying to disassociate myself with
everybody on this panel
and find Republicans.
The only Republican on this panel, Roger.
Well, there are lots of Republicans who understand risk premium. There are lots of Republicans that understand that taxes, a risk premium can be compensated for by a tax. A lot of people who understand financial markets well enough that even in the lack of having a crisis in front of them or even caring about climate change, they would feel that there's enough out there to put a risk premium on it right now. And so I'm kind of hoping that the momentum comes from the people who think that consumption taxes are a lot better way to tax people than taxing their payroll or taxing something that is really good for the economy. So that's my strategy is to
George, what response-
disassociate.
I agree with both of you in the major cautionary, politically cautionary comments. Does this have to be a conservative or Republican proposition? Basically, I agree with that. And that's why actually in the first few months of our organization, we've been reaching out primarily, not interested in talking to the environmental community, but reaching out to conservative groups and thinkers to partner with Hoover Institution and R Street and Taxpayers for Common Sense and people who are identified with a sort of libertarian or conservative position. And I also agree that we wish something big would happen that would cause a crisis that would bring a new president of the Congress to confront this issue. I'm not optimistic that the storm events, dirty weather, does it. There have been some interesting studies about how public attention to climate or commitment to climate has varied over the last 10 years. What is it that's caused the perturbation? Weather doesn't touch it, and I have some doubts about whether another couple of Hurricane Sandys are going to make a huge difference. I think the growing notion that stranded assets, the effect on economic assets, that could have more power, but I don't know that goes far beyond an elite. I think for a revenue-neutral carbon tax that reduces substantial portion of which goes to reduce corporate tax rates as well as individual tax rates, there's sort of an assumption that the carrot here is this is the only way to get tax reform. You want tax reform, there's no other source of revenue that satisfies this. So if you're interested in tax reform, you're a Tea Party Republican or Henry Waxman, you got to have a carbon tax. And the stick is the power plant rule and the EPA regulation that Roger talked about, which is supported by the environmental community and by most climate advocates because it's the only thing we've got. But don't forget, it's the horror we always thought was so unimaginably bad for the climate that it would force Congress to act. That's what we're stuck with, but that's an ugly proposition and a very expensive proposition. And as people realize how ugly and expensive it's going to be, there'll be some interest in finding a plan B, which is cheaper and more predictable. So will that carrot and stick work to be enough, to get Congress to address this? I don't know. Usually sticks are better than carrots. Gas lines are, you have a pipeline to oppose, that's easy to organize around. You have a new tax to propound, that's not so easy. But there's also the possibility, the reverse possibility, the courts will strike down EPA regulation, and then we'll be left with nothing. Does that make it easier or harder to argue that Congress should then get involved? But all of these sticks and carrots are not that dramatic, and I think it remains to be seen whether we can build enough intellectual capital around the idea of a carbon tax to get Congress involved, in spite of the fact that we're not going to have a huge crisis that's going to force that kind of action.
Mona, do you have any comments on how this issue kind of fits into the bigger picture in American politics at this point, and kind of how we think about this, and how much is this on people's minds overall?
Yeah, I mean, this goes to the sense of diffuse. I think people, obviously we saw a lot of this. This is a big issue for very elite audiences who care about it in particular parts of the country, and the rest of the country is skeptical to not interested. And to go back to the 73 example, it was neutralizing in terms of who it affected. It affected everybody, and I think it is incumbent upon people in elite circles to figure out how to talk to people about these solutions, about these ideas, and all of this is necessary. So the way I see it, everything from the renewable portfolio standards to your ideas, all of that debate is essential, because there has to be some kind of consensus that begins to emerge that is the result of people talking about all these things. So this is a necessary precondition to ultimately leading to some solution, I think. Always has been for anything that's a big, complicated problem. But I do think there's a huge political problem in the country, which is that this Congress, and generally, unfortunately, our system today, we are nearly allergic to complexity. And you see people running away from it day in and day out, unless people are forced to deal with something. I mean, immigration and reform is a perfect example. You see it with our medium-term fiscal outlook. You see it on things like GSE reform, Fannie and Freddie reform, which we still haven't done. There is just an allergy to picking apart complex problems right now with the group that we have in Washington. And that, I mean, is a much bigger, profound problem we have, obviously, governance problem that we have in this country that we're all very aware of, but it definitely is an element for this issue, and this issue in a way that I think is going to be really tough.
If any of you have questions for Roger or Mona or George, please feel free to come to the microphone. And while you do that, let me just ask a question in another direction. Roger, you didn't talk much about the international part of this problem in your talk, and I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
I do. I just very simply think U.S. has to lead. You know, I cannot spend any moments talking about China and India until we've done our part. You know, and if it takes them another year after we've done our part, great. But we can always do border tax adjustments or what have you. But I just am not into blaming others for our lack of leadership. It's our job to get this right and to get it done now.
Yeah. And your argument, though, that when we have a model that works, whatever emerges, it will be hugely compelling for everybody, because for a large economy to figure out how all this would work would be way, way down the line in proving to people that in fact this is doable, and it's doable sustainably and all that, with good results.
Well, that's what's exciting about the Clean Air Act, is it really tells us, you know, that it's not exactly the same, but gosh, it's pretty close, you know, and we did it. We ought to celebrate it. It's a triumph. So let's build on that.
I think that a carbon tax is a model that is a basis for international agreement if the U.S. pioneers, the big if. You know, we're almost 20 years into a UNFCCC process, which is basically, we've discovered, is based on a, you know, broken concept, which is countries would adopt emissions limits and then reduce them and would trade to cut the cost. It's never going to happen. In fact, we're another year here into going to Paris and proving that it's broken. And yet, there's no meaningful discussion on the sidelines about pricing carbon. If the U.S. and one of our partners, Canadian pipeline executive, if the U.S. and Canada and Mexico, if the U.S. got serious about this, it would be a North American, Canadians and the Mexicans would join us in a heartbeat. So you'd have a North American carbon price, and if there were border adjustments, I think the likelihood is that a lot of European countries would join, because they're struggling with the relationship between their cap and trade and feed-in tariffs, which don't work together. And if you had a good part of the EU and North America with a common homogenized carbon price, the chances that everybody else in the world, including the Chinese, who might love this as a way to come to an international agreement that had no limits on their growth, everybody else in the world who wanted to access those markets without a tariff would have to join in. So this is a basis. This is maybe the only basis for a real international treaty in the next 20 years.
There is a lot to follow up on here. We looks like we have 4 or 5 people, and please identify yourself. And Adam, thank you for coming.
Thank you. Hi, Adam Wolfenson. That was great, by the way. Thank you all. There's this growing feeling, I think, in the climate community that is after 20 years of failure at the UN or in Congress, that let's treat any market mechanism like cap and trade or a carbon tax like one of those broken bits of equipment on Apollo 13 that would love to have. It would be great, but it's broken, and we're just not going to have it. And so therefore, we've got to work around it with things like the EPA regs or bottom-up or new technologies, a whole range of other things that we're just going to write off and actually give up on those market solutions and try to find other ways around to actually solve this problem. What's your advice to people here who are trying to choose between, do I keep up the fight for the market solutions, or just say, it's broken, never going to happen, we've got to find another way? Thanks.
I'm Machiavellian enough to say, use the EPA regs as your lever. The EPA is moving so quickly at this point that I believe that there is a deal to be done at some point where somebody will say, Uncle, would you trade EPA regs for a carbon tax? I've listened to Administrator McCarthy say what she's proposing is the second best solution. So she's not going to be the problem. The government's not going to be the problem. I don't think Democrats in the Senate are going to be the problem. It's that we just need to have to get to the point where people say uncle. And that train's going down the road, and I'm just tickled that it is.
But somebody's got to work on the, when the shuttle's flying and the equipment's broken, you do a workaround, right? But that doesn't mean that the people on the ground and after the flight is successful don't try to make the shuttle better the next time it goes up. And that's what we have to do.
This is an all of the above, like the intellectual product. I mean, unfortunately, there are 24 hours in the day, so you have to pick and choose which battles you're fighting in which order, right? And there are obviously a fair number of workarounds with a lot of energy, and so you have to fight those battles as well. But there's not any substitute, I don't think, for developing all of these other ideas along the way, because you don't know exactly when the window might open for you to step through it, and you do have to be ready if it does open, right? So.
Please, ma'am.
Erin Lothus, College of St. Elizabeth. Thank you all for your pragmatic idealism. And my question is, you spoke about gaining consensus, engaging beyond the elite audience, and the necessity of a carbon tax. So given that those terms are so antagonistic, what is the necessity for choosing one term that's more effective? And research here at Columbia's Cred Institute has looked at the labels offset versus tax, fee, dividend, et cetera. Do you think it's strategically valuable to identify a positive term, or is it fine if different constituencies are advocating for different terms, and what are the possible terms we can consider and rally behind?
So, yeah.
If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's sort of, I'm not as persuaded by all that. It seems to me you need to call it what it is, and trying to call it something else is a little too Machiavellian. But there are people who want to use fee. I'm certainly prone to use carbon pollution instead of climate change, because that encompasses acidification, which is really rising to be a bigger problem almost than anything that we have seen for a while. So there may be some terminology there, but it sure seems to me like we ought to just be honest about what we're talking about.
I mean, I would differ with that a little bit in that this is one of the issues where the way people absorb information today is just in such soundbite form that if it lands in your inbox or in your device or whatever, and you just the words themselves you reject, you don't take the next step. So I agree with you that eventually, I mean, you're not going to get around. People do a 30-second ad, they're doing a 30-second ad, it is what it is, and people will call it whatever underneath it actually is. But you do want to be able to engage people using terminology that they find they're open to intellectually. And that's increasingly important because people literally read 3 words on their devices, right?
Yeah.
And so those words have to grab you, and you have to feel like, yes, I get that, right? And it goes to a little bit about how to engage the population more beyond just the elite audiences, and how to do it in the complicated issues and simplify them for folks. Not to dumb it down, but just make it a little bit more accessible.
So I'm going to say we are actually out of time.
Oh.
But we're going to extend this for about 10 minutes if our panelists can stay, because it's a great conversation, and we've got some people I really want to bring into the conversation. So if maybe I could ask each of you to just ask questions in turn, and then panelists could comment on both of your comments or questions. So you want?
Questions right away?
Yeah. If you start, and then gentleman behind you talk.
Thank you, Christoph Meinrich and Landforth Center. Thank you, first of all, to the speaker. It's been a very long time that I heard a presentation that was so positively inspirational and at the same time fact-based. Maybe that's just the mix that this country needs. I heard a little bit too little about special interest groups. I feel like all of you guys are sort of referring to it, dancing around it. Not everyone in this country is either just honestly scared or honestly doesn't know or needs a good pep talk. There's people who are like deliberately and actively spreading misinformation in certain parts of the country. The people there are not just, they don't care so much, they're actively, deliberately being bombarded with false information. How can we deal with that?
Very important question. Thank you for asking that. Well,
I'm afraid mine's pretty different. I'm sorry. So I'm Peter Kellerman. I'm at Columbia University. I checked just now, and I think 450 ppm that somebody mentioned is going to be in the rearview mirror in about 15 years. And given that fossil fuel industry people are still exploring for additional resources, it's clear that that industry does not believe that we're going to stop anywhere close to 450 ppm. So I just wonder, in terms of the relatively gradual policy changes that you've been envisioning, how might one grapple with negative emissions?
all right, you're right. Those are very different. Well, let's take each of them. So special interest groups. You must be thinking about that, George, as you think about your plan, and then let's talk about negative emissions and how we get to that.
My answer to both questions is actually somewhat similar, and that is, we're not interested. I don't think we're going to be successful in demonizing or changing the behavior for political or psychological or reasons of the hydrocarbon production industry. The only way you make big changes over a long period of time and with very well vested interests is you change the prices and the market takes them where it takes them. And so that's why if we're going to have a carbon tax, we need something that can be explained not only to taxpayers, but to business in general and politicians and coal company executives and particularly big oil companies who actually, it's the big major oil companies who would benefit the most from the sort of proposal that we've put on the table because they pass on most of the costs and they have a huge tax benefit. So you need to explain something that for a broad range of people will seem economically sound and will be successful in driving the carbon usage in the economy in the direction you want it to go, slowly but inevitably. We're not trying to persuade anybody.
Some of my best friends are in oil companies, and I'm not sure necessarily that they should be stopping exploring for energy resources. So I asked you a policy question. How do the kinds of policy ideas that you're exploring, how would that pay for negative emissions?
I mean, negative emissions, I don't have an answer. I don't know if anybody does have even an engineering answer for that. I do have an answer for how to allow fossil fuel industry to play, and it's a carbon tax. If you look at carbon capture and storage, the only thing that's ever going to drive that industry and allow the coal industry to be a participant in this solution is a carbon tax. So I really share your view that you want to try to be inclusive. So it's one of the reasons I favor a carbon tax is because it's not prescriptive. It allows people of all of those industries, and I really rebel against just calling it a renewable solution because it kind of leaves them out. I think we ought to be as inclusive as we possibly could, but I don't know how to get a negative. I mean, I haven't seen any technology that people say, I can suck it out, or I can put something up there that'll offset it, or, you know, it just had, I mean, I know that Richard Branson put a $10 million, $25 million prize to find somebody who could do that.
There is a woman here at Columbia who's working on a project at Stanford. You probably to suck CO2 out of the air.
I'm sure hoping it'll happen.
We actually have some students in the audience who are working on that project, so we can go talk to you about this afterwards. It's great to see. Yeah. Thank you, Kat, that's right. Mona, I wanted to ask you about special interest groups, because I know you dealt with a few of them during your years in the Obama White House, and then maybe just any final thoughts, and then ask George and Roger for any final thoughts, and then we need to close up.
I mean, this is my thing about the special interest groups and the fact that people will spin information any which way is convenient. It's just the way the game is played. So, like anything, I mean, the healthcare, you name it, any big policy issue gets demagogued by people who decide for whatever reason they don't like it, right? And it's incumbent upon the people who care about it to make better arguments and to play that game effectively and savvily. That's how legislation gets passed. I'm not thrilled with the way our news cycle is. I'm not thrilled with the way information gets spun by people in ways that's completely ridiculous. Unfortunately, it's the system that we currently have, right? So until we fix that, it affects everything that we try to move in Washington in policy terms. So we just have to kind of live with it. So the reason we don't, at least the reason I don't talk about it, is it's just part of the ecosystem. So that's part of the selling of ideas. And getting to a great idea is in a way a little bit separate than the question of how you sell it to people.
George, do you have any final thoughts?
No, just really to join Roger in thanking everybody for coming tonight and being interested in this subject. From my rather perhaps jaundiced or cynical point of view, so much of the effort in the environmental advocacy community, which is my community too, is on short-term issues, what I regard as very short-term issues: EPA, power plant rule, Paris, and virtually no expenditure of serious energy on the long-term issues. And I think that's something that is a shame, and people need to be thinking more about, you know, this is a 100 to a 10,000 year problem, and we need to be thinking in those dimensions. So thank you for being interested.
And by the way, the session is being live webcast, and we're also doing podcasts of these sessions, so they'll be available on our website, and actually getting a lot of people listening to those podcasts. Roger, the floor is yours for any final thoughts.
Well, I'm clear that if we can solve the energy crisis as we did, and if we can solve the air pollution problem as we did, I mean, I can even throw in if we can restore the population of southern white rhinos, and if we can rescue people from space, I mean, as we did. I mean, I just think we've got to think of ourselves as capable of handling this thing, and let's get on with it. Let's do it in a positive way, in an inclusive way. But we have a lot to build on, a lot to give us confidence that we know how to solve these kind of problems. And it's sure our job to be leaders in the world.
Please join me in giving Roger and George a big hand.
Thank you. Thank you, David.